But first, Douglas Murray in today's Spectator magazine has said of Donald Trump's Mount Rushmore speech that was widely dismissed by the mainstream media as racist, that it is a better, far more unifying answer than the dismantling options being offered by his opponents. Who knows, Douglas Murray says, perhaps in an election year that fact will count for something. Here was the president at Mount Rushmore in an address that, it has to be said, did rile his critics.
In our schools, our newsrooms, even our corporate boardrooms, there is a new far-left fascism that demands absolute allegiance. If you do not speak its language, perform its rituals, recite its mantras, and follow its commandments, then you will be censored, banished, blacklisted, persecuted, and punished.
Douglas Murray is the associate editor of The Spectator and author of the book The Madness of Crowds. He joins me now. Douglas, fascinating column this week. I guess your point is that actually there were some subtleties in this speech that have been missed by the mainstream media that actually could be one of President Trump's best hopes of re-election.
Well, first of all, good to be with you again. I don't think there's subtleties that have been missed. I mean, doubtless the subtleties have been missed as well, but the simple text of the speech has been missed. What President Trump did at Mount Rushmore was to give the nation a history lesson, a much needed history lesson, about the fact that the men carved into the mountain behind him were not, as a CNN presenter had said earlier that day, just slavers. That the reputation, the life, the legacy of George Washington, of Thomas Jefferson, and of Abraham Lincoln, just for starters, is not some horrible history which has to be attacked and derided, but rather a subject of great pride for the American people, the American Republic. And that simple fact, that just reiteration of the stories of these men, and then of President Roosevelt, the first President Roosevelt, was ignored, almost totally ignored by the media. The Washington Post said that it's no secret anymore. What this is about white supremacy. One of the candidates possibly going to be chosen as his running mate for vice president of Joe Biden said that Trump had spent the entire speech talking about what she called dead traitors. She said he talked about Confederates the whole speech. He'd done no such thing. And so this is the thing. It's not just the details that are being missed. The president gives an incredibly important speech on the eve of one of the most important days, the most important day, the founding day in the American calendar, and it's just completely ignored.
And you say this media coverage, Douglas, is part of an unweaving of a nation. Yes. What do you mean by that?
Well, this is a very, very interesting story that's been happening for a long time, but it's reached a fever pitch clearly in the Trump presidency. It seems to have been the case that rather than just opposing the sort of woke and revisionist history types, Trump has in some ways actually managed to make these people yell louder and in larger numbers. But what I'm describing is a very interesting thing that's happened throughout our lifetimes, which is a basic unweaving of the fabric of the root of American society. That is everything to do with the founding story. Instead of, for instance, celebrating Christopher Columbus for discovering America, to use the terrible term, everything about Columbus is meant to be embarrassing, as if it would have been better for everyone if Columbus had sailed in the wrong direction. And then we get to the founding of the Republic. Now, today, the New York Times has won a Pulitzer for an ongoing project started last year, which shifts the date of the founding of America to 1.5 centuries earlier, and says that the founding of the Republic, actually, basically, we should talk about the founding of America from the time that the first slaves are brought in from Africa. So that fundamentally alters the story. Then you have the assault on the founding fathers, and that isn't a sort of academic debate anymore. I mean, we've seen people pulling down and defacing the statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and others. And again, one of the likely candidates for vice president for the Democratic Party on the Biden ticket asked a couple of days ago whether statues of George Washington should come down or not, ducked the question. So the founding fathers are controversial. And then we have a poll that just came out a couple of weeks ago that shows 70% of self-identified liberals believe the American Constitution should be rewritten. So my suggestion is, if the founding fathers are just slavers, it would have been better if Columbus had never found America, and slavery is the only story of America, and white supremacy, and the Constitution should be what exactly is left? And that's the question that Donald Trump, whatever you think of him, and God knows there are criticisms to make, but whatever you think of him, what he did at Mount Rushmore on Friday was to say, we have a story, it's a unifying story, it's a story that has encompassed people of every race and background by now. I mean, the list of people, great Americans who the president reeled off, including Martin Luther King, including, the great moral figures, great writers, great sportsmen. He mentioned, Louis Armstrong, and as he said, this list of great people could only have been produced by America. And you see, what he's trying to do there is to give a unifying story back to America. Because what is being offered to Americans otherwise is everything in your history is rotten, everything is for the bad, better that we've never started this thing. So I think, yes, it's a very important thing that the president is doing. And as I say in the piece in this week's Spectator, probably about the best chance he has of re-election is if his enemies, his opponents, continue not just to oppose him, but to oppose everything in the founding of the Republic onwards.
So is he just banking on patriotism? Is it just as basic as that sort of guttural American need to be proud of one's country, which, Americans have much more than we do, usually, which is why this whole thing is quite fascinating.
Well, I don't know about that. I think that the relatively modern desire to think ill of your country, to think badly of your forebears, and to judge yourself in a worse light than anyone else is a really very strange, very modern perversion. It's historically very unusual. It's a modern perversion taught from the academy outwards, which says to be sort of smart, to be a sort of clever person, you must basically hate everything about your own origins, hate everything about your own society, and rather over admire every other society. That's a pretty unusual thing. And by the way, even in the modern age, it's characterized only in the modern West and primarily in the English-speaking countries. It's a modern Australian, American, Canadian, British problem primarily. And I think this is a sort of a period we're going through. It'll finish, or at least come to less prominence, because it's such an unnatural position to hold. I think that most Americans think that America's a pretty good place. Of course, it has its faults, but that, as Gene Kirkpatrick famously said in the Vietnam area, nobody doubted that America could improve, but to improve, it had to survive. And it's the same with Britain. I mean, we do have people now who think that the absolutely smart thing to be is to sort of pretend you're an expert on the colonial period, say that we only did bad things, and to sort of look smart at parties. Actually, these people who are currently telling everyone else to read more tend, in my experience, to know less than almost anybody. Most of the British public, like the American public, have a very important instinct, which is all people in history, all people, including our own history, have made mistakes and we can judge them. But by and large, if you look at the ledger historically, we've been a force for good more than we have a force for ill. And the American people know that. They know that the era of the American hegemony has been better than it would have been if it had been an era of Chinese hegemony or North Korean hegemony or any other. And it's the same with the British. We know that we've had a complex history like everyone else. But we also know that, broadly speaking, we've been a force for good in the world, or at least more of a force for good than for ill. That's a perfectly reasonable insight. It's totally justifiable. There's no reason to feel ashamed of it. And I think that the people who think that the sort of smarty pants thing to do is to be a sort of self-loather should just realize that they are a sort of weird masochist in an international marketplace of very willing and eager sadists.
Well, that's why I think there was such anger this week, actually, towards Harry and Meghan speaking out from their Los Angeles mansion to criticise the Commonwealth. Now, Harry, you would presume, knows a little bit about it. Meghan, I would imagine, knows not that much at all. And they thought it was the trendy thing to do. But I have sensed an anger from the British public like I haven't seen before when it comes to this couple over those comments. And again, I think it's been missed by the mainstream media, actually. But there's a real fury that they would challenge the Commonwealth, which has been the Queen's life work, and while is far from perfect, in many ways was set up to make up for some of those wrongs of the British Empire.
Well, I mean, look, first of all, what is perfect exactly? What is perfect? Is Turkish history perfect? Is Russian history perfect? Is Chinese history perfect? Is a Chinese present perfect? I mean, you want to get specific on this. What is this talk what is this talk Harry did of Prince Harry did of, we're sorry that we haven't made the world what it should be for you. What is the world meant to be for you? What is this perfect world that was meant to be created in time for the millennials to come along? I mean, what is this? Well, I mean, I think that the greatest generation of American and British soldiers who stormed the beaches of Normandy and stopped the Third Reich, I think they did what they could to make the world pretty good for this generation.
Which the Commonwealth played a huge part in, of course.
Absolutely. And, I think there's a lot of very weird things going on in our time. It is slightly typified by having a prince and princess lecturing us on privilege. I can never quite get that one out of my head. But the main thing is, look, a new ethic has been arriving. It's what I write about in The Madness of Crowds. A new ethic has been arriving for some time. Opportunistic people, slightly cowardly people, and a lot of others are at the moment shifting and trying to make everyone else shift to take account of this change and to try to make sure they're on the right side of it. I strongly urge people not to do this. I strongly urge people in countries like Britain and America not to hate on their history and be solely judgmental of their forebears. I strongly urge people not to play the privilege game. Strongly urge people not to play the race baiting, race hierarchy, every race against each other game. Strongly urge against that, and much more. And it's perfectly possible to say, you know what, everything you're inviting us to do will lead us to much worse hells than we've been through in the past even. So don't play these games. Work out what they are in advance of playing them and say, I listened to Prince Harry and his wife, and I don't think they know what they're talking about, and I don't think I particularly want to hear from them. We have plenty of very good examples of how people should behave and how people might think and act in their lives better. And it's a rather uncomfortable but true thing that it happens that Prince Harry's grandmother is about the best example we've got going, certainly in Britain at the moment, or perhaps ever, of how a life of actual service should be led, of how real devotion to country and to improving people's lives can be led. And it's not in lecturing people, and it's not in berating people, and it's not in playing weird zero-sum games of history, but in showing people how to feel a very reasonable and deserved pride in things that they should feel pride in. And so, as I say, I think there's a very strange thing happening in our era, but it's perfectly possible for people to say, I'm opting out of it. I do, and I strongly urge other people to do the same.
And just finally, Douglas, do you feel like the world might be catching up with you when it comes to cancel culture after this letter signed by J.K. Rowling and about 150 other liberal types was published in Harper's Magazine this week?
Well, I mean, it's hard to know what to laugh at more. A bunch of people signing a letter saying, please don't cancel people. and then being cancelled
For signing
or,
it.
or the people who say cancel, or the people who say have removed their signatures from the letter because they say when I was signing this, one actually said this, an author I'd never heard of before. She said when I signed this, I just thought it was one of those vague and pointless sort of things. You know, well, you were right on some of that, and she said I didn't realise that my call for greater freedom of expression was going to be seeing my signature beside people who I don't 100% agree with. And no, I mean it's great seeing these people. It's great seeing the whole liberal woke thing eat itself. I'm delighted in watching that. I wish it had happened faster, and I wish that people just realize the point of free speech and free exchange of ideas is not just to talk about it, but to do it. And we've got a generation who are very bad at that, and I hope they catch up fast.
Douglas Murray, Associate Editor of The Spectator and author of The Madness of Crowds. Absolute pleasure to have you.